Welcome to Cover Book Beat. I'm your host, Roger Nichols. Our guest today is a man who lives life large. In his teens, Russell Heath hitchhiked to Alaska and lived in a cabin in the banks. Is the Tanana River? Is that the correct pronunciation?
Tanana River.
Tanana River.
Yeah.
In his 20s, he lived in Italy, then traveled overland across the Sahara, through the jungles and over the savannas of Africa and into southern Asia. In his 30s, he sailed alone around the world in a 25-foot wooden boat. In his 40s, he wrote novels. In his 50s, he bicycled the spine of the Rockies from Alaska to Mexico. He's worked the Alaska Pipeline as an environmental lobbyist, the Alaska Legislature, and ran a storied environmental organization fighting to protect Alaska's coastal rainforests. Several years ago, he moved to New York City to dig deep into leadership development and coaching. He now coaches business and nonprofit leaders intent on making big things happen in the world. His latest novel is Rinn's Crossing, which deals with Alaskan environmental issues both in the real world and the very specialized subset world of the state legislature. Very pleased to welcome Russell Heath. Good morning. Good afternoon by your point.
Hey, thank you, Roger. I'm glad to be here.
Well, this is a fast-paced adventure story, no question about that, but it seems to involve the reader as more a partner in creating the sense of the novel than many others do.
Oh, interesting. Tell me more. How did you see that you were part of the creation here?
Well, the mental pictures, you bring your experiences to the mental pictures that are evoked by the author's writing. But in this case, how you react to the characters is going to depend a great deal on your own personal political motivations, I would guess to say, because there are no white hats and black hats. Everybody's hat is gray in this.
Yeah, thanks for noticing that. And that's exactly what I wanted, because, in the world, it's usually not black and white. Mm-hmm. You usually have two different people that are both fighting for what they think are right. And that usually causes a tremendous amount of conflict, because sometimes two rights can't be reconciled. And though the book's political, I didn't want to make it ideological. I didn't want to be there, having a political point of view, but I wanted to show how these different issues that are still alive in Alaska, absolutely, even today, bring good people, cause them to do bad things. I mean, it's a thriller after all. Yeah. So they make some unethical or illegal decisions, but they're making those decisions in pursuit of what they think is right.
Mm-hmm. And go ahead.
And that's what causes the conflict. So there's not an arch villain. There's not a Voldemort here. Mm-hmm. And depending on your point of view, one of the four main characters may be your hero, and the others your bad guy. But it's the political point of view that you bring to the novel that causes that.
And I found it fascinating as a militant moderate. I fox on all their houses, but I also understand all their motivations too. That was really fascinating. I almost reactivated my 50-year-old poli-sci degree to get involved with the fun of the legislature. That was amazingly good. I want to hear more about that in a second. But well, let's talk about the political maneuvering in the legislature. You were actually part of some of the actions that are reflected in the book here, as I understand.
I actually initiated some of them. I have some of my own dirty stories to tell, but yeah, all the manipulations and the procedural procedural manipulations, everything that happened in that book happened at some point in Alaska history, with exception of the last one. The last one was my creation. But every other dirty trick, every other underhanded whatever happened at some point in Alaska history. I just brought them all together in the same story.
Which adds to the mixture. Just as soon as you think you see what's going to happen, oh no, here comes, and it's not a twist so much as a shift in perspective that I found fascinating, going back and forth between the different characters and their actions. And sometimes it was difficult to tell right away why they were doing something, and that would come out later as well. So you built a lot of tension in that regards as well. So nicely done.
Well, thanks.
I also want to talk about the title, because that is lovely ambiguous itself. I mean, I first thought of it, I thought, okay, this is some mountain pass or a river ford or something. And then I thought, well, it could be like crossing the bar, some kind of difficult journey, or taking an ocean voyage across the Atlantic or something. But it also can mean crossing and double crossing. And It just wonderfully apt title. And did you have the title before you started, or did that come in the process?
It came very early, so I never had a working title,
Mhm.
right? It was Rinn's Crossing from the very beginning. And, to be honest, I took it from one of, I'm going to blank on his name right now, the guy who wrote All the Beautiful Horses or The Road.
Cormac.
Yeah, Cormac
Uh,
McCarthy.
yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
So he had his trilogy of the border trilogy, and one of them was called The Crossing. And I just liked that thought. And the thinking of Rinn's Crossing was Rinn, who is kind of a classic Alaskan character. So Alaska is well peopled with men, usually young men, who come there to live off the bush. They can't deal with people. They want the excitement of the adventure. And they're, kind of socially inept at some respects.
Mhm.
And we call them the end of the pavement guys. They come all the way to the end of the pavement. And then, like me, they step off into the bush somewhere. And then, a few years down the road, there's a mass murder out of the bush when they totally lose it. So Rinn is that kind of guy who comes out and lives in the wilderness. And his crossing is when he realizes that life in the wilderness, that life of aloneness, no longer works for him. And he doesn't know how to do anything else, right?
Mhm.
And then I won't give it away, but that's his crossing. Is so
And I saw
that's the
that.
key.
I saw it also in some of the information that he receives, crossing his mind and making him change his thoughts as well. We won't go into those specifics because those are some of the fun part of the plot.
So Roger, before you go on to your next question, can I tell you another story?
Yes,
about
please.
crossing?
Yeah.
So in Alaska, if you're living in the bush in Alaska, right, you have to make a decision twice a year, once at breakup and once at freeze up, about which side of the river you're going to spend the next 2 to 4 weeks on, right? So at breakup, as the ice is going out, you can't get a boat through the ice. So you got to be on one side of the river or not. So it's in part a decision of where you're going to spend that month, on which side of the river. And I tried to work that in to the story, and it came off as too didactic. So I ripped it out. But I love that thought of when nature's doing her thing, either freezing up or breaking up, you've got to decide which side of the river you're going to be on.
I love that. And there's a passage very near the end. I'll have to look that up and get back to you on that. But that made a reference to me, so I will check that. I took notes as I talk a lot of passages. I want. Oh, by the way, Alaska is a character in the book itself. This is not that common anymore, but some of my favorite novels, the setting is as much a character and has influence on the other characters as other characters do.
That it's interesting. In my first novel, Alaska was even more of a character. And I really make a distinction because Alaska, the first novel was based on a Greek play. And, in Greek plays, particularly in Euripides, there's that deus ex machina, the gods come down and solve the problem because the humans can't solve it in the end. So in many ways, in my first novel, which was Broken Angels, Alaska was this force, right, that everybody else had to react to. And the decisions they made, ultimately they were bad decisions because, it was a Greek tragedy.
Yeah.
Greek tragedies tend not to turn out well. But it was Alaska that is how everybody related to Alaska that determined how they reacted. In Rinn's Crossing, Alaska is a austere, more Christian god, in the sense that the four characters are each fighting about how Alaska should be treated, how Alaska should be worshipped. All right. So Alaska doesn't play as active a role in the second novel, but it's critical. You couldn't have this book in another state where because people have a very religious relationship to Alaska in a way that they don't in other places.
Well, it's the last frontier, as has been called, as well too. And we are driven by that frontier myth in America. There's always some land you can go over the hill and rape and pillage and settle and make your own and tame, as it were. So yeah, that's a factor. you put in, I always check other interviews, and you put in one and you said that there are no ideological angels in this book. I think we kind of discussed that a little bit, but it's true. The fact that each character has a flaw, not always fatal, but certainly in there and in the mix. And is it harder to write complex characters?
Well, it is. And of course, for me, characterization is the most difficult part. I mean,
Mhm.
it's a pretty complex and convoluted plot, right? And that comes out pretty easily. But how do you work a character into all that and make it believable, and not just believable, but somebody that the reader wants to, you know, go on this journey with? So, but on the other hand, you know, all you have to do is look internally to see our own internal contradictions. You know, look internally and see how close we all come to an ethical or legal line, right? And and the fact is, I think that most of us do, even militant moderates, right, want to put up their fists sometime and fight and say, okay, this might be stepping over the line, but I think my greater goal is worth this.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I have some quotes
Uh-huh.
that I want to. I think the thing that does it for me is sometimes the little detail you put in that's a telling character reveal. Um, uh, Chuck at the bank. Chuck touched his typing again. It was probably where he kept his soul. I saw that and I said, "Oh, there's a magic piece right there."
Yeah. Well, you know, we're in Dan's head. So Dan
Mhm.
Wakefield is the native and one of the four main characters of the book, and he's trying to get more money out of the bank because of what Rinn did to his logging operation. Um, and yeah, and that's just normal human behavior. Is we like to stick knives in people that aren't giving us what we want.
Mhm. Yeah, but it was, really, it was a character reveal almost as much as it was of Chuck at the bank, which
Right.
again this is very layered stuff. You can do a quick read because it's an adventure, but there's so much going on. And I found as it tended toward the latter part of the book, when all these pieces start coming together, I saw more philosophical insights come out as you were able to say, okay, now I've got this plot thing done. See how that reacts to you and you and you. And it's exceptional writing, I have to say. Yeah. So,
No, well, thank you.
yeah. Um, Here's another one. Rinn was driven by a hunger. His soul echoed for lack of something he couldn't name. He felt encaged by emptiness, like a bug in a glass jar. What an interesting, the emptiness as much a cage as a presence. I thought that was an intriguing analysis there. Um, does this
You know,
stem from anything particular?
well, you know, we Americans and Europeans have a great luxury. And the luxury we have is we get to design or choose our lives. Through
Mhm.
all of human history, you know, from when we descended from the apes, you didn't have a luxury because every day you had to survive.
Mhm.
And it's only really in the last 150 years that normal people, you know, non-kings and queens, could have an existential crisis. I mean, it is really the luxury of the modern age, is that we can have an existential crisis. We can choose who we want to be, and we can choose what
Mhm.
we want to do in the world. And the trouble is that it's really difficult. It's really difficult to know what it is, who you are, and what you want to be, particularly when most of the guidelines have been stripped from us. I mean,
Mhm.
we're not very religious, and it used to be a religious, I don't want to use the word cage or jar, but it used to be a religious support that told you who you were
Mhm.
and what you did in the world, right?
Yeah.
And then there was a cultural one, but now everybody has their own individual culture, right? I mean, there's just so many different cultures. So it's the enemy, you know, that, you know, Emil Durkheim talked about in the 19th century is this separation that we have from our culture, from a religion, from something outside of us that tells us who we are, that puts all the responsibility on us to choose who to be. And most of us can't do it. It's just too difficult.
Right. And
And so you feel empty inside.
It is that, unless you have something powerful that comes to you from somewhere, and that can be that way. Gosh, fascinating talking with you, because I have a feeling you're at least a three-quarters philosopher along the way.
Well, we're all philosophers because we're always wondering what the hell life is all about. It's again that option. But I'm also a life and leadership coach, and so I'm working very intimately with many different people who struggle with this. Who am I? What's my purpose in life? How do I make this short piece of time that we have, this little flick of time that we have, meaningful to me? It's an important question. In many ways, it's unanswerable because we have to create our meaning. And that's what most people don't realize. We have to create the meaning in our life.
Absolutely. And some of us get lucky in that and some of us don't. So here's another one that I particularly like. Said sex was never as easy as it was made out to be. It hooked your heart and rubbed your nose in the bleakness of your life. There's a pretty down period in the character.
Well, that's Rinn again, right? He's starting to make his crossing. He realizes that everything, the way he's designed his life, lived in Alaska, has a casual sex affairs. It's not nourishing him. The bleakness of your life is just not nourishing him, but he doesn't know how to do something differently.
Fascinating character. By the way, I was going to look up the name Rinn. Is there any special significance to that?
No, not at all. I was my two sisters and my father paid for us to go over to Amsterdam one week and about 20 years ago. And one of my sisters is an artist, and so we were going over there to look at Dutch art, and of course Rembrandt's the premier Dutch artist, and his name is Rembrandt van Rijn. But it's R-I-J-N, and that was too exotic for this book, so I got rid of the J and just put a double N in there.
Great. I like, because I've not seen that before, and I thought, I'll bet there's a significance. I'll ask him about that. There's always something interesting. Let's see here. Which reminds me, as I mentioned about sex, he says, when he's talking about Kit, he says he was okay with Brown Bear, but this woman made his adrenals kick over. So I thought it was an interesting comparison. And then there's a longer one. I'm sorry, I just love some of these pieces. It says, any path you choose through life has obstacles in it. Obstacles which to overcome require you nick some part of yourself. It might be your word, your ideals, your love for another, but to continue on the path, you had to compromise something. And there's a longer passage that I won't quote, but how do we sell out? To what, to whom, and for how much? I think is a question of life as well. That is largely about this book.
Well, I'd like to push back on the sell out.
Okay.
Because, for us to live, just as human beings, we have to kill other things. We have to make, even if it's the wheat behind you, it's, kill animals, whatever. And we hurt people. Just us going through life, we're going to hurt people, we're going to kill other organisms, and we can't live a pure life. There's no possibility of living a pure life. And so so at some level, we're always compromising our ideals. Right. So just at the very basic of living, we're going to compromise some of our ideals. And then, of course, it's a slippery slope. When do you when you say that compromise is too great?
This is one of the problems as a poli-sci guy, is that if you believe that your motives are pure and noble, then you have to get into office to enact them. And sometimes you have to do things to get into office that are against those. And at some point, you either say, I've gone too far, or what the heck, I'm just going to keep on doing this forever because I like the power and the glory, et cetera, et cetera. Did you ever think about wanting to be in the legislature yourself?
Oh, yeah. Or I'm more of the executive type. I just want to be ruler of the universe.
But I was going to ask him more about your activities as working with the legislature.
Well, So I represented the environmental community in the Alaska State Legislature, and Alaska is a resource dependent state, right? I mean, it's primarily oil, but there's fishing, logging, mining, and those resources are both a substantial part of the economy and also a substantial part of the culture. So as an environmentalist coming in and say, hey guys, do we really want to dig up this, this plot of land or cut these trees? You're fighting both the culture and the economy. So you're the bad guy generally. And so representing the environmental community in the Alaska State Legislature is both an exercise in I just want to say futility. It's Pyrrhic victories at best. And a lot of people don't like you. I mean, yes, people don't like you. They don't want to speak to you, and they scream and yell at you. All right, so there's that. But the purpose of having a lobbyist in there or environmentalist in there is, one, is to educate and try to open people's eyes up to different things. And also, quite frankly, is to stop things or slow things down. It's a lot easier to stop something than it is to create something.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And there were a number of bills that I stopped. The Billy Macon's big bill. So Billy Macon is the developer character in the novel, and he's also a powerful senator, co-chair of finance, and he intends to be governor. And the bill that he introduced, which was a timber bill, which related to state forests, was modeled on an identical bill that was introduced when I was a lobbyist in the state legislature. And I had a Republican Senate, a Republican House, and a Republican governor who all supported this bill. So it's like, there's no way that I'm going to stop this bill. And there was lots of money behind it. The whole timber industry was behind it. And not just the Alaska timber industry, but Pacific Northwest timber industry. So I stopped that. We stopped that bill. And we stopped it in a number of different ways. But one of the dirty tricks that was in the novel was a trick that I employed as a lobbyist. And so when I had relationships with everybody, and I was call it running my trap line, where I'd go from staff member to staff member to staff member to pick up all the gossip and all the news and everything that was happening. And one of the things I learned is that this powerful senator, who was chair of finance, was working so hard on his timber bill that all the other legislators' pork wasn't getting through the finance committee. And if they didn't get their pork, all their little money bills back to their constituents, they weren't going to win their next election. So they were really upset. So I said, I've got to encourage him not to work on the pork. And so what I did is I got this old fax machine and took it to a friend's house. And we started at the very first thing in the morning, we would grab his fax number, and then we would run faxes into the office for all day. So no one else could fax into the day. And then I had 4 stay-at-home moms. I found out he had 4 telephone numbers into his office. So I had 4 stay-at-home moms that hit redial on their phones all day. So no one else could call into his office. And email wasn't really an issue back then. It was just getting started. And his caucus went berserk because they couldn't talk to the chair of finance committee. So he had to pull the bill. Yeah. And that's what killed the bill.
It's the equivalent of the denial of service attack on the website these days. But my first reaction when I read that was, because I'm thinking like we do now, I said, well, we'll just go out and get some burner phones and pass it out to the numbers that needs it. But they didn't have such things back then. So pretty fascinating.
Yeah. And then the question, of course, at the end, is, so I have Kit do that in the novel. And in the end, Billy Macon accuses her of subverting the public process. And she, of course, like all of us, thought she was in the right. It never occurred to her that she might be unethical in what she did there.
But, what's the cost benefit ratio here? Yeah. The analysis is always done, whether we do it formally, intellectually or not, we're always making those choices,
Well, there are 2 games that we're playing though, and that's, people don't think of the second game. The first game is, I want to win in this particular battle. But the bigger game is, you're an American working within a democracy. And if what you do to win your little game, stopping this bill, injures the bigger game of being in a democracy where the institutions work and you respond to the fact that if you're outvoted, you don't get your way.
Mhm.
And so what we tend to ignore when we're fighting our little game is that we could be injuring the far more important game up here.
Mhm. And the only two laws that really exist are gravity and unintended consequences.
Right.
Somewhere I came across the quote too. It says, supposedly attributed to Einstein, he says the two most common things in the universe are hydrogen and stupidity. So I think some of us live those lives.
I like that. Okay.
Yeah. Here's another quote. I think this is, if I remember this is, she really felt comfortable around these people, especially the men and the women who acted like men. They were terrifyingly adult, people whom childhood had abandoned without a trace. They looked out at the world without curiosity or compassion, never doubting their right to impose their will on those who shared the state with them. That's a pretty incendiary kind of a thing to say.
Incendiary?
Maybe that's the wrong word, but it's a kind of a harsh look at somebody.
Yet notice yourself and myself that when somebody else is doing something that we don't like, when the world isn't working our way, we always make those people wrong. We always diminish them morally as human beings. And that's what she was doing. So she was reacting as all human beings tend to react, unless you're Gandhi or Martin Luther King, right? Is those guys are jerks. And you have all kinds of rationale for diminishing them.
That's right, because if you see them as equals, it's hard to do that. Absolutely. And this is so much more fun. Yeah, and here's some perceptions. I want to ask you about children of the beach. You used that phrase a couple of times, and then in one of them it says they were children of the beach, outcasts in this world, forced to make their way in life by rules not made for them. It was an unusual phrase. I wonder if there's a background to that.
So yeah, that's a Tlingit phrase. So Tlinkits are the native peoples that live in that part of Southeast Alaska, and they also include part in British Columbia and the Yukon. But in northern Southeast Alaska, it's Tlinkits. And you know, as social creatures, the worst thing that you could do to an individual is to outcast them from the tribe or outcast them from society. And that fear is still inbred in us. Even modern Americans, whatever, is being outcast or not being liked or not being respected. So for an outcast in Tlingit was a person who's thrown out of the house, thrown out of the clan house onto the beach.
Okay.
And of course, all of Tlinkits, all indigenous people worldwide were essentially cast out of culture and have to adapt to a culture, a modern, technological, highly rational culture where the rules aren't made for them.
That's so true. Yeah, we see that. And then this one got me. We live for what we cannot have. And that's very close to the end. And it just struck me as it's a simple observation, but it's profound at the same time.
Yeah. So do you know who Simone Weil was?
Can't say I do. No.
She was a French philosopher, and she was started out Jewish and became a Catholic. And she wrote this, a book on our relationship to God. And she said, we mostly know God by his absence. And that really struck me, because we know him by his absence, because he's usually not here and we have to make up things. And so that's what I put in. I can't remember what character's thinking that. I think it was probably Rinn. And, he was living for what he couldn't have. What he wanted was connection. But his whole development, his whole personality was for isolation, to live in a cabin in the middle of the Alaska wilderness. And he didn't know how to connect.
And I don't know, this is a book that I think it's someday going to be read by college classes on how you do it. How you do an action adventure and philosophy and religion and everything all mixed together.
Well, I certainly would like to encourage, since you're asking good questions, but I'd like to remind the readers that it is a thriller, and it's not a book they're going to have to labor over like some Dostoevsky or Tolstoyan novel. It's trying to figure out what's going on.
What I will say as a reviewer is, while you're reading this, you're going to be exposed to a lot higher level than he hit him in the face kind of stuff. There's going to be a lot of interesting thing to go with it, which I think is good, because every person who reads it will read it differently, but also every time you read it, your different experiences will change your perception of it. And if it isn't there to begin with, then it won't be as good to read the second or third or fourth time. Right. So I think so. Is there anything I haven't asked you that you would like me to ask or talk about?
Interesting. I think maybe just to reiterate, you have 4 characters that all have a different vision of Alaska. And it's in their different vision of Alaska, in pursuing their different vision of Alaska, they step over legal, moral, and ethical lines. And it is in their different views, right, that the conflict arises that causes the thriller. And again, it's not an ideological novel, even though it's dealing with ideology. And it's something that we all do. I mean, these last 4 years with Donald Trump and how polarized we've been, it's so easy for us to dismiss the people on the other side of the spectrum.
Oh, yeah.
And in our dismissal of those people on the other side of the spectrum then causes the conflict.
Beautifully said. You're a man of good words, as well as many of them. I can see that. I think that we'll wrap it there, other than to say our guest is Russel Heath. The book is Rinn's Crossing. It's highly, highly recommended. And thank you so much for spending time with us.
Hey, and thank you so much for your good and perceptive questions. It's been great discussions.